Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode from the webinar series from the Belonging Project. When we decided to do this session, we knew that there was a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress and a lot of difficulty from many, many places. Whether it's the months that we've spent in the pandemic, whether it's the uncertainty of knowing when this is going to end, whether it's having our kids at home with us. I share an office with an 8-year-old, and I have to supervise remote school, or the upcoming holidays. All of those stresses are there. We know nationally anxiety and depression has gone up, and we don't expect that it's any different in our workplaces. Add to that what we see as a very, very divisive political season and elections. As of today, nothing's been called officially, and I am very aware that some announcements may come while we're doing this webinar, and some of you may disappear and leave us behind, and that's okay because this is being recorded. Now, just some housekeeping before we get started. I want to level set. Almost all of the webinars that we do through the Belonging Project are 60 minutes. But after we sat down and pulled the content together on how we can effectively give you strategies, we realized we had 75 minutes of content. So here's what's going to happen. We know that you live by your calendars because we do, and so you may have to leave after 60 minutes, and that's perfectly fine. This will be recorded. Everyone will have access to it after, so if you want to catch up on the last 15 minutes, you can. One of our speakers actually has a 3 o'clock, and so she will have to leave. So when you see Janai drop off, you'll know why. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to turn it over to Gina Cho because today we're going to open differently than we have for any of our other sessions. So joining me is Gina Cho. Gina Cho is an attorney. She owns her own law firm, but she's also an author. She's recognized as an expert on mindfulness, well-being, resiliency in the legal profession. She's also a published author, I may have already said that, on attorney well-being. This is her book, The Anxious Lawyer, an 8-week guide to a joyful and satisfying law practice through mindfulness and meditation. And she wrote that with Karen Gifford. Saifa Shah has worked with Gina extensively through some mindfulness programs, which we're incredibly grateful for. So there's more to learn about Gina, and you can find it online. Janai is also a good friend. She is the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Perkins Coie. Thankfully, my move to Chicago has been alleviated by me having people who can meet me for lunch halfway between my building and their building. And Janai brings a wealth of experience to the diversity and inclusion space, in addition to her past as an entertainment lawyer and a culture and entertainment and music aficionado. I hope I said that correctly. So these are my friends. These are people that I call when I'm in a crisis and I say, oh my God, elections are Wednesday. I don't know why we didn't think about this. We need to do a program. And they say, okay, yes, I'll squeeze you in. So Gina, I turn it over to you to get us started.
All right, thanks everyone. Thanks, Corey, for that introduction. So I know that for me, and I know probably for most of you, there's this tendency right now to have our minds be in 10 different places, but we're here physically in this moment. So I want to just invite everyone to arrive and let's just practice being here in this moment and paying attention to what's happening. So I invite you, if you like, to take one hand, place it right over your belly button, and we're just going to take a few deep breaths. So breathing in through the nose and breathing out. So that 2 more times, breathing in, breathing out. One more, breathing in and breathing out. And if you close your eyes, you can allow your eyes to open, and I will turn it back over to you, Corey.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That was good. Thank you for doing that. I appreciate it.
I
Okay,
agree.
so we're going to start talking about what we're referring to as the belonging imperative. And the idea here is, even when we had our town halls at Psych-Arth around race and anti-racism and systemic racism and all the things happening nationally, there were people who asked, what in the world does this have to do with the law firm? This has nothing to do with the business and practice of the law firm. The truth is, though, that it does, because these things that are happening nationally, they impact all of us as individuals. And when we walk into the workplace, we don't shed who we are. We don't shed the emotions, the stress, the anxiety that we have. And most of us are spending the better part of our awake hours at work. And so all of these emotions and feelings are coming to work. It's also a diversity issue in that a lot of these issues that we're facing nationally are impacting our underrepresented and diverse communities differently. In this election specifically, race, the rights of LGBT people, gender rights are all things that almost half of our population believe are at stake. And so it's impossible in this particular political season to simply deem certain things as politics. In fact, an argument can be made that if you are unable to see how these issues are affecting individual people, especially those from underrepresented groups, then perhaps you're not listening. So what do we do with that? How do we cultivate belonging when there's such division? How do we cultivate belonging in our communities and, more importantly, in our workplaces so that we can actually have the benefits of belonging? And so I want to go ahead and just quickly remind us about why belonging and inclusion is so important. Sin, do you mind popping that slide up for us? Mike, is everything okay?
Not sure.
All right, I'll keep rolling. And somebody just let me know if there are problems with the slide deck. The reason belonging and inclusion are so important to the profession is we know that when we do not have belonging and inclusion, we are not able to be our best selves. Our ability as organizations to cultivate inclusion and belonging leads to us being able to be more innovative, more creative, more competitive. It also impacts well-being. And that's one of the things that we unfortunately are sort of late in acknowledging as a profession, is this very deep connection between belonging and well-being. Now, one of the things that we know about belonging is that it's this feeling that you belong to a tribe, that you belong to a group, and that you are valued. When we're talking about diversity, we're talking about all the differences that people bring to the table and all the ways that they're different. When we're talking about inclusion, we're talking about the ways in which we are leveraging those differences and those skills and those talents of everyone so that they can thrive. But the way I like to talk about inclusion is to say that genuine inclusion creates spaces where everyone can belong as they are in their authenticity, and that genuine inclusion does not ask us to fit in. Now, when you begin to think of inclusion and belonging in that framework, all of a sudden you start realizing we can't ignore the things that impact the people who we're telling to come to work and be their whole selves. So those are the benefits of focusing on the belonging piece and why it really is a leadership imperative for us not to ignore what is happening around us, but actually to be active participants in cultivating atmospheres where we can lead and work and thrive through these difficult circumstances. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about well-being. For a large percentage of our population, when we think of well-being, we think of wellness, and we think only about physical wellness. But when we're talking about well-being, we're talking about more than just physical wellness. Now, we recently had a session, the Association of Law Firm Diversity Professionals, and we had a session with NALP, another organization. It was a full day conference, and Aaron Reeves was one of our speakers, and she said something that I felt as if, for all the people who've asked me before, well, why are we focusing on mindfulness? Why is well-being a diversity issue? And she just summarized it in one sentence. She said, if wellness and inclusion are not integrated, neither works well. And that's so important. If wellness and inclusion are not integrated, neither works well. Now, we know with belonging, for example, when people have belonging, they have a sense of meaning in their life and a sense of meaning at work, which means they do better work, they're more engaged. It leads to wellness, it leads to connection, it leads to understanding, and it allows for authenticity. So here are some statistics around belonging and well-being. Belonging leads to psychological safety and employee engagement. In fact, the one single metric that consistently and universally ties to a person's workplace commitment, motivation, and pride is a sense of belonging. Now, when we have supportive environments, our brains are triggered differently, and all the things that help us to solve problems better and easier are also triggered. When employees have a high sense of belonging, this is very interesting, and every HR person should be paying attention to this. 75% fewer sick days. 75% fewer sick days when you're able to cultivate belonging. And those sick days that people take equates to almost $2.5 million worth of lost productivity every year. And this is only per 10,000 employees. So imagine what we're losing as a country. We see 56% increase in job performance with belonging. Now, the cost of not belonging that ties into wellness is simple. With isolation, we have 40% of people that say they feel isolated at work, and the result is a lower organizational consent and lower engagement. Similarly, burnout ends up being not just about exhaustion, but also about isolation. Now, research shows that when you're obese, your longevity, your life mortality is reduced by 20%. When you drink alcohol, like 30%. When you smoke, 50%. Social isolation and loneliness, 70%. In other words, it's more destructive to the health of our employees and ourselves as individuals when we have isolation and when we do not belong. It feels like physical pain. Now, when we don't have well-being and we don't have belonging, we have people who are we have people who are anxious because anxiety and stress go up. In fact, one of the studies that Aaron Reeves mentioned in her presentation that I actually looked up some articles on, was that kids in classrooms who do not feel like they belong have much higher levels of stress and anxiety. These are children, and they don't perform well. And then the ones who do perform well have very high anxiety and stress. And it's no different than what we have in the workplace. Gina, what would you add in this conversation around the importance of well-being and how it connects to inclusion and belonging?
You know, I think when having that sense that I belong here and that I have a place here, it's like such a fundamental human need. You know, it's like they've done studies where like children that don't have that sense of connection, like literally die. And so, you know, I think it's just sort of recognizing that it is this deep common desire, this feeling of wanting to be valued, wanting to be loved. I feel like that's sort of the thread that can really bind us, especially in this time of, you know, divisiveness. There's this common thread and this desire to be happy and to have that sense of belonging, to be loved, to be appreciated.
Yes, thank you. That's so true. So how do we cultivate then inclusiveness? How do we cultivate inclusive leaders when we have all of these things going on? Benign, you have some thoughts regarding inclusive leadership and what the essential elements are for that. Next slide.
Thank you, Corey. And can you guys hear me just fine? Making sure my audio.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And Sin, can you move the slide? One more.
And while she's moving that, Corey, I want to just comment on your and Gina's comments about the value of well-being and the value of belonging. One additional data point that I think is especially compelling, especially to us as leaders, is the fact that the more that people feel that they belong, the more that they feel included, the less likely they are to leave the organization, right? And we know that the cost of attrition is enormously high. It is more than just the cost of the person's salary and benefits and so on. It also includes the cost of recruiting and potentially paying more for talent. And so that cost can be 1.5 to 2 times as much as the individual that you lost. When you think about that on a large scale in an organization that does not foster that sense of inclusion and belonging and well-being, your attrition costs are really driven up quite high and quite dramatically. So just another sort of economic tie-in in case we needed some additional points to sort of lay the foundation for the value of inclusion, well-being, and belonging. So I do want to talk a little bit about this idea of inclusive leadership. And so if you could move forward to the slide that has the picture of the head, the brain, and the little pieces going around there. Yeah, thank you. So looking at the left side of this slide, I want to talk a little bit about inclusive leadership, and we're sort of tying this all together into how do we create this culture of well-being and belonging. We've talked a lot, I'm sure many of you have talked a lot about the traits of inclusive leaders. And I want to revisit some of those by looking at some research that Deloitte has done. Deloitte's done a lot of research in the space of DEI. And I think they have nicely captured sort of the 6 key traits for effective, inclusive leaders. And I like this model also because it sort of defines leaders broadly, right? Like it's not limited to those who have official leadership titles, but it recognizes the fact that we are all leaders, no matter where we sit in an organization, no matter where we sit within our social networks. We all have the ability to influence others and to influence decisions, to influence stakeholders within our professional and personal or social networks. So let's just quickly go through some of these traits. The first one is just commitment, and having a visible commitment to inclusion and modeling that commitment. So inclusive leaders really articulate the authentic commitment to diversity and inclusion. They challenge the status quo. They question the norm. They hold others accountable, and they demonstrate in different ways and in ways that they are able to that diversity, equity, and inclusion are priorities. At least they are personal priorities to them, right? Even if they aren't able to necessarily influence the organization. Inclusive leaders are courageous, and they are humble as well. So they are aware of their ability to influence and recognize, those opportunities and those capabilities, and also maybe the limitations that exist there. Where they can push, they do. Where they may not be able to influence change, they are aware. They also admit mistakes when they make those mistakes, and they create space for others to contribute. I think most importantly to this point of courage and humility is that they also just admit when they don't know, right? A lot of inclusive leadership requires us to become more aware of what we don't know and to do that digging, to be self-reflective, to lean in, to dig deep, and to learn more. And that relates to this third trait of cognizance, essentially an awareness of bias, especially unconscious bias. So inclusive leaders will demonstrate, they admit an awareness of those personal blind spots, of those unconscious biases, because they've leaned in, they've learned, they've researched, they're trying to make those unconscious issues a little bit more conscious and begin to work on them. They're also willing to point out flaws in the system. So when we're thinking about inclusive leadership in the professional context, they are willing to lean in and point out where there are flaws in the system, in the policies, in the processes, so on and so forth. Inclusive leaders are also curious. Very, have curiosity about others and certainly about their own blind spots and areas that are opportunities for learning. I like to characterize this as having a growth mindset, right, or an open mindset. They take constructive feedback well. They try to implement that constructive feedback whenever it is possible and however it makes sense. And they also demonstrate empathy and understanding for those around them. Cultural intelligence or cultural competence, that's a term that we are probably more familiar with in the law firm D&I space. An awareness of cultural competence. They are aware and attentive of others' cultures, and they adapt to those cultures as necessary. They also try to ensure that the organization and that the systems and policies are adaptive or respectful of those cultural differences as well, right? Many of you may be familiar with the Intercultural Development Inventory. It's one of my favorite tools for measuring cultural competence and actually showing us where we are versus where we think we are, right? And what research shows is that oftentimes we think that we're more evolved in our cultural understanding and cultural competence than we really are. The nice thing about the IDI is that it shows us where that gap lies and is a great way to sort of get inclusive leaders on that pathway to learning more, to understanding more, to doing that self-reflective work. And then the sixth and final one is enabling effective collaboration. And I think for people who are leading departments and leading teams, this is super important. We're going to talk about this in the context of different facets and different dimensions of diversity. I think it's especially important, in these times that we are all working and that we're talking about all of the many issues that we're juggling and grappling with, and thinking about how do we create a safe space for individuals from different cultural backgrounds, from including our personal identities and also our ideologies, right? How do we create a space for everybody to show up and to collaborate and to work as team members? So inclusive leaders empower others. They pay attention to the diversity that exists in the room, both in the diversity of ideology and the diversity of identity. And they create that psychological safety that we all need to show up and to do our best work. And they're really focused on doing that for the benefit of the team, however that's defined, right? The small team or the macro team, which is the entire organization. So those are kind of the 6 key traits as identified by our friends at Deloitte around inclusive leadership. And again, this, we talk about it as the inclusive leader, but that term, that leadership term applies to all of us because we're all leaders no matter where we sit in the organization. So I'll turn it back over to you, Corey.
All right, thanks, Janai. And I just want to remind everyone that while we're moving very fast and we've got a lot of content to cover, feel free to use the question and answer box to send in questions. And we will weave in answering as many of those questions as we can as they apply to the topics. So Sin, could you do me a favor, please, and go to the section that's titled A Paradigm for Courageously Interrupting Isms. Okay, so this process of engaging requires us to be courageous. And when I think about courage, I think about courage in terms of doing the thing that you know needs to be done that you don't want to do. And when it comes to cultivating belonging and inclusion, we're daily required to choose courage. And in the sixth trait that Janai just talked about, there was a discussion about one of those traits being courage. And it shows up over and over and over. In fact, Brene Brown did some research of thousands and thousands of people asking, what is the one thing, what makes leaders great? And the research came back with people consistently saying that in order for their organizations to be great and to achieve the best that they set out to be, that the organizations need to have brave leaders. And so she went through this research of sorting out what does it mean to be brave and what does it mean to be courageous. Now, a lot of times when we think about courage, we unfortunately have very macho views of it. And courage isn't really always about running into buildings and saving people, although those things are courageous. But courage is also having fear and walking through that fear regardless. Nelson Mandela Mandela talks about it as, being courageous, being brave is not about being fearless. It's about acting despite the fear. Susan David, who does a lot of work on emotional agility, she defines courage as fear walking. All of these definitions really lay open the fact that there's a level of vulnerability. So a few years ago, I did a TED talk talking about what it means to choose courage, whether it's to interrupt bias, isms. And there are 5 elements that I laid out that apply to this situation, apply to divisive topics. And the TED Talk was actually born out of divisive topics. But then, there's a difference between we can't agree at work on whether systemic racism is real, or we can't agree at work that white privilege exists versus some of what we're facing now as a nation which is much bigger. And so I want to go through the elements of this framework, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time digging deep because the TEDx is on YouTube on the TED.com site, and you can find it and you can spend time with it. And the first element is that we are to listen differently. The idea here is that many of us listen and we listen to respond. And those of us who are lawyers, some of us who are lawyers, I don't want to brand everyone, but I hold myself responsible. We can sometimes get caught up in what part of what you said is not right, as opposed to listening to what people are actually saying. So sometimes we're listening to respond. Sometimes we're listening to debunk. Sometimes we're not even listening. We're acting like we're listening, but we're not listening. And so that level of listening that we need, listening with empathy, is a higher level where we're connecting around our values, where we're really hearing what people are saying. And that requires us to exercise empathy. Well, what is empathy? Empathy is different than sympathy. And you will see in a lot of the research that empathy shows up over and over in some form of fashion as necessary for us not only to be courageous, but also for us to be inclusive and cultivate belonging. So empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. You don't have to have the exact experience of someone, but you need to be able to listen and try and put yourself in their position. Now, often when we're having these discussions, we don't do. Someone starts talking and you say, well, I can't even listen to you because you're racist. Or someone says, you know what? It's really difficult for me to stand here and listen to your arguments when you're saying if I voted for this particular person, that makes me racist. And then you say, but you are. And oftentimes, that's why our conversations end up going nowhere, and we end up not learning more about each other. And so what we have to do then is to listen differently, to listen beyond some of the words that are being said, to make space for difficult conversations, even if we don't want to have them. Now, here are some caveats. If you are not in a good mental state, you can get a timeout and you can say, I don't want to have this conversation. No one is saying that you have to engage in difficult conversations if you're not ready, if you're not in the mental state, if you are suffering trauma. There are a lot of things that are very traumatic for a lot of people, not just now, but always. And you always have the opportunity to tap out. Listening with empathy, we're going to include in our resources a short video. It's 3 minutes, and it goes through explaining how empathy is different than sympathy and how oftentimes we get empathy wrong. But then a second element is cultivating curiosity. How do we cultivate curiosity? So someone is sharing something with you. They have positions that are so diverse from yours. And it's worth saying, where does that come from for you? Someone is saying to you, I'm experiencing some racial trauma because of everything that's going on nationally and the videos circulating of unarmed people being killed. And your view may be completely different. Your view may be, I don't know, I mean, let me just throw some things out there that people have actually said. Well, they should have complied, they should have obeyed. Cultivating curiosity would be to say, tell me what about that for you is difficult, or tell me where you're coming from, and vice versa. Again, no one is saying that you have to do this when you're not in a good frame. And in fact, this is one of the areas between listening differently and cultivating curiosity that I've received feedback from people from underrepresented groups who say to me, are you really asking us, with the trauma we experience, with the impact of racism, sexism, Islamophobia, whatever the ism is, are you really asking me that I have to make space for content or messages that may be just wrong or troublesome? And what I'm saying is, if we're going to move forward and cultivate belonging, we have to be able to have different perspectives and hear it. We also have to be able to name things. So I'm not saying that all opinions are equal and that you make space for everything. Because at the end of the day, we do have values in an organization that guide us, but we also have individual values that guide us. And we have to be able to have a conversation about why something is problematic, which means we have to be vulnerable. We will be opening up ourselves to things that we don't want to have, to receive feedback we don't want to hear, or to even be hurt in ways that are not intended. And if we are part of building belonging, and if we're cultivating those spaces, then we have to know that practicing vulnerability is part of the deal. We must also be willing to stand up and speak up for each other. To be able to say, I'm listening to this experience. I'm not trans. I have a family member who's trans and who I shared a conversation with a few days who was having very high anxiety around a lot of issues regarding the election. And, this person's perspective, a young person, she's a teenager. They are a teenager. Her pronoun is they, not she. Was that rights that would impact her were going to be stripped away. And being able to come around people and say, I will speak for you and on your behalf, even though I myself am not trans or non-binary. And then redefining belonging. In our workplace, being able to say, we brought these people together. We are all different, but we belong to each other. And maybe it's in our communities and maybe it's in our families. To say, how do we take these people that we have brought together and we say we belong together, and how do we cultivate what belonging is? Is it these values over here that are dividing people, or are there other values? And if the organization has values, and those values are things like excellence, competitiveness, innovation, inclusion, most of us have values around inclusion and values around diversity, then we have to confront ourselves about what those values mean, how we cultivate belonging around it. And so before I turn over to Denai, I want to go back to some of the pushback I received. Take this election, for example, and I'm just going to summarize some of the things that are just juxtaposed, I'm not saying that word right.
Juxtaposed.
Things that are, say it again.
Juxtaposed.
Thank you, that word. Against each other that are just rapidly different. On one side, there are a lot of people from underrepresented groups who right now feel fear for their safety. They feel threats of violence would be targeted at them. And they feel that the way half of our country has voted is endorsing or sanctioning a dehumanization and removal of their human dignity. Now, we can have a whole 2-hour workshop on where that comes from, but that's not the purpose of this discussion. On the other hand, there are people who believe, similarly, this is about human life. Maybe the human life is different. Maybe they're thinking of, fetuses and embryos and unborn babies. But on the other hand, there are people who are staunchly like, no, that's not what it's about. It's about something else. And here I am saying, listen differently. So person A is saying, you are voting for something that harms me. So let's put me in the equation. I'm an immigrant. My parents live in Nigeria. They haven't been able to come see me for a while. I'm also a woman. I'm also Black. I'm also a mother. I have people in my family who are Muslim, and I have people in my family who are not binary, okay? So I'm saying I'm threatened. And then the other person feels like, well, no, it's not about that. And I'm not racist, and I'm not phobic, and I'm not any of these things. How do we have a conversation? And how do we sit there and say to the other person, well, tell me more about that. What does that mean for you? Janai, I turn over to you to discuss how we have inclusive conversations.
So you leave me with the easy stuff, right, Corey?
Yeah.
So, this is, I think you've laid out the framework for sure for having these inclusive conversations. And it is, or maybe some guidelines rather, around having inclusive conversations. And the conversation will be unique to the individuals that are involved. It will be unique to the topic that's being discussed. The conversation will be unique to the setting in which you are in, right? So, the individuals that are involved, are these family members? Are these work colleagues? Are you having this conversation via Zoom with work colleagues? Are you having it via Zoom with family members on a Sunday afternoon? I have a Sunday afternoon Zoom call with my family all over the world. Are we doing it there, right? That's interesting and new.
Yeah.
I was going to say, are we doing it over Thanksgiving dinner? It's unlikely that any of us will be sitting around a table having dinner on Thanksgiving Day with people outside of our immediate families. Yeah. But so my point, though, is that these are very subjective and they're contextual, right? I think, Corey, you really laid out a nice set of guidelines around listening more, listening well, and trying to do that even when the issue is something that is deeply personal or deeply emotional. And I think that's when some of these things become the most challenging, right? When we feel a particular issue in a way that's really unique to us as the individual. So a couple of things, and I want to underscore what Corey said about courage and being courageous. So I'm going to say some things and provide some guidelines, some additional guidelines for dealing with these issues when there are issues that, for which the boiling point's pretty high, it's pretty emotional. You feel strongly, the other person or other people feel really strongly, and it feels like, there's this huge gap between us. This idea of having courage is super important. You don't have to have that conversation in that moment. If you are not feeling strong, if you are not feeling courageous, if you just aren't feeling in the mood, right? Just in general, right? Like, I'm just not in the mood today because it's hard right now, right? There's some days that, for me, talking about the murder of Black men by police officers is just too much, and I'm just not in the mood, right? And so it's, that's okay. You can always come back later on to the individual and say, I've been thinking a lot about that conversation that we had yesterday, last week, whenever. And I have some additional thoughts that I want to share. I have some reflections. I want to follow up and ask you about a couple of things, right? So you can be courageous in the moment. You can be courageous later on. Perfectly fine. Another piece of this idea of courageousness is your own vulnerability as well. And I really like this tactic, which is being honest about your feelings. And that may not always work. And so that's perfectly fine, but oftentimes it does. I think it really works well in family settings and sort of the more so, and with friends. It might be a little bit more difficult in a professional relationship, but I've seen it work there as well, and I've even myself used it. And that is to identify the impact, let the other person know about the impact of their words on you. Oftentimes, the other person may be thinking about this issue or the challenge that you're talking about in a very objective sort of way, in a factual way, in a laying out the facts, the statistics, so on and so forth. And you're thinking about it in a very personal way, very different. And you're having a hard time understanding each other. You're talking past one another. If you start to hear things that are hurtful, I would say that. I would use one single word, which my good friend Brene Myers shared with me about a decade ago, and that is the word ouch. Ouch. That was an ouch moment. What you just said really hurt. And in my experience, that often stops the conversation full stop, right? It comes to a screeching halt. And oftentimes it is an aha moment for the other person, really understanding, oh, I didn't intend to hurt you. I was just trying to lay out some facts and some figures, by the way, none of which, may even be, they may be perfectly right, perfectly legitimate. But it was hard for you to hear that in that moment for some reason, right? And so they don't necessarily want to hurt you personally. And so to say that that was an ouch moment can be pretty powerful. And I say this actually from experience. It is quite effective. I have used it a number of times. I will just say one more thing about these inclusive, well, two more things maybe, about inclusive conversations. And Corey sort of touched on this already. She said something about, when you're hearing something that is just fundamentally, that you're fundamentally opposed to or is radically different from your position, and you're trying to find this common ground, and you can say things like, well, can you tell me more? Or, how did this affect you? Or what I hear you saying is that absolutely, do I have that right? I think those are all great questions to ask yourself. I would also, or to ask the other person and to engage in that dialogue. I would also ask yourself as you're thinking, as you're actively listening and you're getting ready to, sort of come back with your response. Think about, as you're hearing this person talk, think about what it is from their perspective that you agree with. Are they saying anything at all the words that are coming out of their mouth, are there any words that you agree with, or that you find some commonality with, right? So, okay, oh, I like that one piece. Yeah, I like that idea, so on and so forth, right? Also ask yourself, is there anything about your position? Is there a chance that anything that you were saying and anything from your position or your viewpoint that might be problematic, that you yourself might question? If you were to put yourself in someone else's shoes, looking at this from a different viewpoint, is there something about this that could be challenging? You don't have to do this out loud. This is an internal conversation that you're having, but it gives you a moment to sort of unpack some of the things that you are hearing, and to put a little bit of space into that conversation, and to actually employ some empathy in terms of the other person's argument, no matter how crazy it may seem to or sound to you, or how outside the box it may sound to you. Try to do that when you can. Again, this requires some courage and some in that moment. And if you're not in the mood, perfectly fine in that moment. But it's another tactic, another tool that you can put into the toolkit. And I will just say one more thing, and this relates to the idea of space. And this, I love quoting, a lot of my dear friends who spend a lot of time researching these issues and speaking on them almost exclusively. And this one comes from Mithu Bhasin, and that is, and Gina, I've heard you say similar things as well. That is, when you start to feel elevated levels of emotion, you're getting, fired up, literally, you're feeling hot, and you're feeling deeply emotional. Try to take a breath and give yourself some space. Try to press pause in the conversation. This is easier done when you're in a group of people and maybe you're trying to facilitate an inclusive conversation, or you're bearing witness to a conversation. To ask everyone to just stop for a moment, everybody to stop talking. Let's take a collective breath and not just say anything for a little while.
Yeah.
And then find space to re-engage and to start talking again. It's a great level setter, and sort of helps us remove some of the emotional aspects of the idea, of the concept, of the topic. Remove that from the table and reframe, and maybe even refocus what we're talking about, what the real issue is. Because oftentimes in these conversations, we actually get away from the core thing that we were talking about, right? And we find ourselves off on tangents in different areas. So let's reframe, come back, and try to find, an opportunity to have a more productive conversation.
Yeah. Very important. And I think one thing that isn't in any of the elements of the various research that we've coded, or even our own work that we do, the day-to-day learned experiences, is the role that education plays in all of this. It's going to be hard to understand some of the things that we're talking about if we're not willing to know more, if we're not willing to learn more about the experiences of others and how that may be impacting the way they perceive the world and the way they're reacting, or even the way various, if we're just talking politics, the way various policies impact them differently, which is why it may be a diversity issue in the first place, opposed to a political issue. And so education is also a big part. Before I turn over to Gina.
Super important. Yeah, I think we took that for granted, Corey, and you're absolutely right. I said that earlier, talking about being self-reflective, digging deep, doing your own work. That cannot be overstated. Doing your own work and understanding different perspectives and the impact that that these issues have on different communities, on communities of color, on LGBTQ plus community members, on women, you know, different groups that are certainly different from our own, and understanding those perspectives a little bit more, especially if it's an identity that we don't share, understanding the identity and the impact of various issues on those identities.
Right, right. And it goes the other way too. So like for me, I have a ground level view into Midwest rural America because them are my in-laws. So anyhow, we also will be sharing an article with you as part of the resources from Harvard Business Review that Janai brought to my attention, and it's called Leading Inclusively, but it gives an outline for inclusive conversations, being mindful about limiting topics, and basically we shouldn't be limiting anything, to practicing active listening. Janai's covered that, I covered that, seeking common ground, Janai covered that, and taking a stand when necessary. And we've covered that. So now we've talked about all the tactical things that we should do to create belonging, to cultivate space, to allow people to come together. And what we will do, if our panelists are okay with this, we didn't discuss this before, we may end up attaching the PowerPoint for you. I'll talk with them later and we'll see. But before we do that, Finn, can you tell us the CLE code, and then I'm going to turn it over to Gina to talk strategies on the health side. And it could be Whitney, whoever has the code.
And we can't hear you if they're speaking.
Hello?
I just unmuted you, Sam.
All right. Why don't you text me when you have the code? Gina, go ahead. I don't want to take one more minute of your time because you've got really, really good stuff to share with us.
Sure. Well, thank you. And, I want to kind of maybe pull some of the threads that both Corey and Janai has shared and kind of put it perhaps a slightly different angle into the mindfulness perspective. So I love this idea of bringing empathy and curiosity. And often we think about these things as things that we offer to others. And I think really the place where we need to start is starting with ourselves. So being able to offer ourselves empathy, and I would add to that compassion and also curiosity. So depending on sort of how you're raised and sort of your makeup, and I certainly put myself in this category. I'm not one of those people who's like readily able to even identify what my emotions are. I might know that I'm feeling hot. I might notice that my heart's beating really fast, but I may not be able to even like articulate what's happening. So someone might say something to me, and I can feel that there's an emotional reaction happening, but it may not be. Sometimes it might take me a day or two to be like, oh yeah, that thing that you said to me, it was really upsetting. It was an
Oh, she's breaking up.
Oops.
Can you guys hear Gina okay?
I can hear Gina just fine.
Okay, so go on. Sorry, it's me.
As Janai said, it's an ouch moment until later. And I think that's where that like mindfulness and meditation practice really comes into play, which is to notice what's happening in the present moment and bring a lens of compassion. And so, when we're having these conversations around, especially, very difficult conversations around race and identity, the thing that I started to notice is that there are these triggers, there are these pain points, there are these ouch buttons sort of hidden, in my psyche that someone might just walk onto without any understanding or sort of a textual understanding of why it is. And so this actually happened to me recently. And one of the things, and I think this is something that happens to a lot of people of color, is people will often say to me like, oh, you're so articulate, you speak without an accent. And to me, that's like a huge ouch point for a lot of reasons that I won't go into. But what I notice is that I will often have this reaction to that person saying it, that it's completely sort of out of proportion, right? Because, right, this is a huge ouch for me, and I'm bringing this whole set of baggage, and sort of I'm overlaying like a narrative to that person, where that person may or may not, share in that narrative. So I think that, idea of bringing curiosity to even sort of your own ouch, all of these sort of hidden landmines that we all have, is just so key. And kind of returning back to that like common thread, Janai said this so beautifully, where, what is sort of the common denominator? Is there something about what that other person is saying that I can agree with? And I think often, there is that sort of common bond that we all want to have the sense of, need for belonging and need for safety. And if we can sort of start there, it's a really great place to start. So if I could have the next slide, please. Right, so, this idea of being here.
You know what, Gina?
Yeah.
Give me 1 second. Let me interrupt you. Just because some people will have to leave at 3, the CLE code is SS2844. S as in Cyfarth, S as in Cyfarth, 2844. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So this idea of actually returning to what is happening in this moment. So, this morning with the election results still unknown and having to prepare for this presentation and another presentation, and I'm trying to get my daughter ready for daycare, and, my mind is just this swirl of different thoughts and feelings and emotions. And I just paused for a second and I took a deep breath and I was like, okay, let me actually pay attention to what is actually happening in this moment. And in this moment, what is happening is that my daughter is smearing a piece of banana just all over her face. And let me just pay attention to that and just how precious that is. And we can sort of get, end up lost in our sort of mental fog and really sort of miss these little details and, these like little moments of joy. So, I think especially now there's just so much despair and just so much suffering that's happening. But if by paying attention to the moment-to-moment experience, we can have these little moments of like, oh, but despite all of this, there's this little moment, this little pocket of joy, and really paying attention to that. But I could have the next slide, please. Okay, so, I think all of these, being courageous, being vulnerable, it requires a certain level of resiliency. Next slide, please. So, resiliency is the ability to bounce back from difficulties. And, there are lots and lots of difficulties, of course, everywhere right now. And next slide, please. And also, and also surviving, but also really thinking about, what are the practices that I can engage in that helps me to optimize how I feel. And I think even just before we even get to the optimizing how we feel, like right now, like what are the things that I'm doing on a day-to-day basis to just get through and to, survive. I think that saying of like secure your own oxygen mask before helping others is so crucial. So, this week, I like just told people I am just feeling like the bones in my body feels heavy for me to carry around, and just to ask for like a little bit of, I don't know, it's almost like just like saying, mercy, this is just where I am. And I am doing these, self-care activities just so that I can get through. And again, I think that also requires a certain level of vulnerability, but also kind of recognizing that there are probably people on your team, no doubt about it, people on your team that are also in that similar space. So, really talking about people's like self-care strategies. And I've seen some organizations do this where everyone is invited to come up with their own self-care strategy and they share it. And I think that's also part of this idea of creating an inclusive space, right? Recognizing that you and I may have different ways of maintaining my sanity and my well-being. And what does that look like? Next slide, please. And so this link between mindfulness and resilience, we know that mindful people, right, when you're actually able to pay attention to what's happening, you're able to cope with difficult thoughts and emotions without becoming overwhelmed or shutting down. And I think this is just sort of, kind of highlights all the things that we've been talking about is, and I think that's a very natural thing to also have happen, right? I kind of noticed this is when I'm feeling very strong emotions, I tend to feel flooded and I just sort of go into like shutdown mode. And my husband and I, we tend to sort of deal with conflict very differently. And one of the things that we have to sort of navigate and learn is, when I'm feeling really frustrated, I'm just like, I need time off. Like I need my own space because I would literally just feel like this emotional boulder. Whereas he's like, oh, let's chat about it. Let's get into it. And so, again, bringing that sense of mindfulness to the way that we engage and have these dialogues and, finding this common ground. Next slide, please. Right. So one of the practices that we can practice, and there's a lot of research coming out about implicit bias, and also how do we get to know our implicit bias, right? Because implicit bias by its by definition are hidden often from us as well. So there's a specific mindfulness practice called loving kindness meditation, and there's a really interesting body of research that's coming out that suggests that when you practice loving kindness meditation, it first increases your ability to be compassionate, which means, so when I talk about that word compassionate, I want to sort of define it for you, because I think some people, especially lawyers, kind of confuse it as being like weak or being a doormat, allowing people to walk all over you. But compassion is the ability to recognize when there is suffering, either in yourself or others, and also connecting with that natural desire to alleviate that suffering. And if you kind of think back to all of these things that we're talking about, I mean, that's really at the crux of it. It's saying, hey, I'm having this ouch moment, and I want you to recognize that I'm having this ouch moment, and also to engage in that natural human desire to try to do something when someone is saying, hey, something that you did or said, intentionally or unintentionally, was an ouch moment for me. And so this practice of loving kindness meditation can allow you to get to know your implicit bias. And I think that's really kind of encouraging. And then also, mindfulness is the ability to add a moment of pause between the stimulus, right, whatever the stimulus may be, and your own reaction, which then becomes a response. So we all have these automatic behaviors and thoughts and triggers that we have, right? It's like, how, like when you're putting on a pair of pants, to put your left leg in first. And then, so these are sort of like automatic behaviors, which is fine when you're getting dressed in the morning, but probably not that great when you're, thinking about groups of people. So this practice of loving kindness meditation kind of increases your capacity to be compassionate. So we're all born as compassionate beings. You don't need to learn how to be compassionate, but it is a muscle and we can practice it. So I think I'll just spend about 5 or 6 minutes and we'll do a short sort of a loving kindness meditation practice, and then we'll come back for closing remarks and thoughts. And for me, this is the practice that I come to when I just feel completely drained, or when I'm really having a difficulty with someone, and I'm not sort of like ready to engage with them, but it's like, especially with like family members and stuff like that, you can't exactly just like, right, like their family or their close friends or whatever it might be. So this is sort of a tool that you can use to work through your own emotional experience. And then again, kind of what Corey was saying before, bringing that sense of empathy and compassion and curiosity. And so let's start. So let's start by finding a comfortable seated position, bringing a sense of kindness towards ourselves in this moment, and paying attention to your posture and just noticing how you're sitting. And might feel nice to sort of roll your shoulders back, and what what does that look like if you can be really kind to your body in this moment? And if you'd like, you can close your eyes. And when you close the eyes, it's a very different experience than having the eyes open. So just taking a moment to notice what this experience of sitting here with your eyes closed feels like. And I invite you to bring your attention to the space in your chest where your heart resides. So actually see if you can pay attention to your physical heart. This muscle that's constantly working for you and pumping blood throughout your body, and this place of strength and courage. And so as you bring your attention to this space in your chest where your heart lives, you might notice there may be some physical sensations or perhaps some emotions that come up. And so whatever it is you're able to notice and observe, just allowing that to be. And from this place of connecting with the heart, I'm going to offer some words, some phrases that you can repeat quietly, silently in your own mind. And if any of the phrases doesn't feel quite right for you, you can feel free to either skip it or choose another phrase that feels just right for you. And so I'll say the phrases and you can repeat it in your own mind. May I be kind to myself. May I find peace and healing. May I accept and find ease with things just as they are. I am doing the best that I can in this moment. May I be kind to myself. May I find peace and healing. May I accept and find ease with things just as they are. I am doing the best that I can in this moment. And once again, bringing your attention to the area around your physical heart. And let's just sit for a second in this space of silence, this moment where there's nothing to do and nowhere else to be except to simply sit here and take a breath. And now let's very gently close the practice by wiggling the fingers and toes and moving your body in any way that feels good to you. And when you feel ready, allow the eyes to open.
Thank you. All right. Gina, I don't see any questions. You okay?
Yeah. I was not expecting that, but yes, I'm fine. Thank you.
Please remember that you can't pour from an empty cup. And like Gina said, it starts with us, self-compassion, self-love, self-empathy. And when we're able to do those things, then we can offer them to others. And the same is with being inclusive and cultivating belonging. The work starts with us, looking inward and being conscious of where we are. So we hope this webinar has been of benefit to you. And Gina, if you have closing thoughts, I'm going to let you close us out.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think, turning, Rumi said this, don't look away, look at the broken places because that's where light enters you. And I think collectively, that's all the work that we're doing right now is looking at the broken places and not turning away. And that certainly takes courage.
Yeah. Yeah, it does take courage. And it also takes boundaries. Being clear in what is okay and what isn't okay, and living into our values. And when we're able to connect on values, we're able to actually understand a lot more about each other than when we just stay on the superficial level. So thank you very much. Thanks to every one of you who hung on past the 3 o'clock Central Time. Gina, thank you for your generosity in giving of your time and your intellectual property and your resources so freely. And Janai's not here, but same to her. Belonging Project couldn't continue to do this without people like you who give so freely. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. SS 5844. Nope. SS 2844. The CLE code. We'll send you an email with a list of resources when we send you the information for CLE. Thank you. Thank you. Mike, it's a wrap.